We're live right at 10 o'clock. Oh, yeah, bring a little microphone
a little bit bigger so I can see.
Yeah. And my name is Judah McNeil. I'm here with my father, David McNeil.
Thank you.
And we are going to talk about the generational gap. You were saying, Dad, you pointed out to me, which was sort of a surprise. I had never really thought about it, that the generational gap really started in the 60s. Right.
Well, that's my impression of it, the 60s. I think it was, I forgot to tell you, I think that it's the generation gap, and that is the difference between cultures, way of life of younger people versus their parents. It occurred it became we became aware of it and talking a lot about it about the same time that women began to get into the workforce in a large way. That women left the home. That homemaking was not the normal thing, but something you chose to do. But and I remember just a little mark of it. I remember I still have pictures of us coming out of church in the 60s, 63, 2, 3, 64, I think it was. And my mother, my grandmother, and my sister were wearing hats. They wore hats to church. Well, that's all gone. People say, well, what's the big deal about that?
Not all gone, but it's...
Well, I mean, it's not all gone. But it used to be, what I'm saying, what's all gone was the prescription that women wear hats to church, cover their head. Now, I think it's in the Bible. But it also said the Bible, decide for yourself, even that same place. But and it was at the same time women began to wear pants to work and so on. Now that doesn't seem like a big deal to you, but it was a big visual deal and a cultural deal. At the same time, kids began to listen to music that their parents didn't listen to. The Beatles were a good example of that.
Well, that was always, before you get into that, that was one thing I wanted to set up, is that I think we were talking a little bit, and the three major things that contributed, that changed in the 60s were mobility, technology. We have TVs and radios.
Everybody had
exploded into the society. And the third one, what was the third one? Education. And the third one was education. Now, education.
Urbanity. I think urbanity, that is bigger people moving to the city and people taking on a more urban style of life. Okay, I'll talk about that. But we'll go back now. Remember, the generation gap is different lifestyle of young people versus the lifestyle of their parents. And that is the music, the morals, and the jobs that they take, and what their goals in life are, as far as, and also whether they're going to have families, and so on, whether they're going to live in the same place or whether they're going to be mobile, they don't know. And a lot of it, I think, now that I'm thinking about it, had to do with a kind of flexibility up to an older age, of flexibility about whether you're going to get married, flexibility where you're going to live, what job you're going to have. And that still remains as a mark of youth, is that flexibility. Everybody says, well, young people get married later. Well, they're more mobile. They stay around,
particularly though in a affluent culture. Like one of the things that I've been coming back to and thinking about is the detrimental effects of being an opulent, and just having so little need to survive, and I think that's a huge influence on the difference, having that choice, right?
And so obviously during the 20s you had a kind of generational gap, but that wasn't in the country. That was in the cities. The roaring 20s and all that was not not among my dad. I mean, my dad was living in small town or small town feeling place, or a kind of a rural community and a rural class.
Mm.
It's when people started moving to the city and thinking of themselves as city and acting city. Okay, and one of the big changes was at the time was centralization of schools and high schools. So you had here in Morehead City, High School, and at the same time you had centralization and integration of black and white. Now, without any reference to race, what we're talking about is when you centralize and you take, say, from here in Morehead, you took from a little town, Newport, to a larger town, Morehead, where they had different. Newport was much more agricultural, Morehead more tourist based. Okay, you put them in the same. Then you bring in the black community, who was a different culture, different way of doing things. You bring them all, you put them in the same education. You begin to wipe out you begin to degrade the culture of each came from. See, when Morehead City High School was I knew everybody where they went to church, Methodist, Presbyterians. You go to sit, you centralize it. It begins to degrade all of that.
Yeah, one of the biggest criticisms of the melting pot is in a soup of so many ingredients, you lose the taste, the distinction of each
exactly
flavor,
each ingredient.
That's
right. Yeah, exactly. And that we celebrate that in America, that we have different cultures, but we do things that inhibit the preservation of those cultures. And again, I said, not without referring to race or language. It's mixing and having. Now we all speak English, but we speak different varieties of English, and you can hear. And I still have personally have huge prejudice against when people talk a real Southern accent, which I have some of and had worse in the past. And I thought, how could people ever think of me as an educated person when I heard myself on the tape of like 50 years ago? How could they think of me as an educated person? So I still have that feeling, so there at one time was an idea that we had cultures were separate and so on, and they lived in kind of a system with each other. Now the urbanization has put all of that together. And what has popped up out of that have been that the youth generates its own culture through mass media and through education. So the university, what you see now with these protests and so on like that, you see that there must be a university culture, so that's separate from their parents.
Yeah. Well, and to go back to what you were saying about the Beatles, the onset of technology exploding, and as far as radio goes, that was just the first step, really. But that introduced ideas and introduced rock and roll. I mean, the 60s were rock and roll was something that encouraged a divided generation.
Yeah, and music is a tremendous vehicle for culture, and rock and roll had tended to be very open about sex. Started with Elvis. You used to laugh about it, but the fact of the matter is, Elvis did introduce sex into the popular music and put it on TV and wherever he had his shows, which were very popular. And he was very openly sexual himself. Not sexual like let's go to the bedroom sexual, but just that eroticism. Sensual. Yeah. And then the Beatles came in, weren't so much that way, but their music still had a sense, and we used to laugh about whether an older person liked the Beatles or not. And that's when the first idea of that was right in there when the idea of the generation gap came along, There was music that the youth liked and the older people didn't like. And you could see it. And during the 60s, I think when it really, and as you said, you told me, it was around 1970 when you had the counterculture revolution,
Yeah.
where you really had the explosion of the hippies and all that. Then you had a real break.
It was contention between the two generations.
You had generation gap, not only that, but generation contention and generation combat, you know. And the throwing off, then it wasn't just the taste, but throwing off the moral values. We don't have to do that anymore. We can do whatever we want to do.
Yeah.
And I think that tends to continue as the hallmark of generation gap, if there is any generation gap. Of course, now we create new generations easily every 15 or 20 years. You know, with Gen X, Gen Z, I don't even know. I'm of the baby boomers, and then what's after that? I can't remember. And it goes on and on. And they'll have a new.
It's getting the iterative gap is a lot smaller.
Yeah, it's smaller because people can create their own thing. You ever heard this? You know, I remember when what do they call black rap? That whole culture,
R&B.
You know, black rap, hip hop.
Yeah.
I remember when I saw somebody on TV. This must have been 30 years ago. Yeah. The hip hop culture. But they have their own culture. So there is the development of culture as you go along. And say, if we're talking about just white middle class, which is the largest population in America, probably, or it used to be anyway, there's always that's the generation gap we're talking about.
Yeah.
I don't know that you have such a generation gap in the Jewish, say the Orthodox Jewish community. But again, it is largely urban or urbanity. The cities are people who think like they're in the cities. It's not in the country. If you think about the Amish being the quintessential rural, you don't have generation gap.
Yeah.
Or very little.
Well, but that's a particular. I mean, that's a
no. But that's just a cartoon of. But it still goes on in the country. You have farmers and there's children take over the farm and so on like that. I mean,
it's a growing problem where they have less and less.
Well, they have less and less for sure. But but in other words, what that means is they have a problem because less and less people live the agriculture or the rural way of life.
Well, and that goes back, I think, to the idea of just our cultural opulence, where we just have so much money and so much.
We can do what we want to do.
We can do whatever we want. We don't need to be farmers. We can be YouTubers. Well, and a lot of it is the younger generation having access to these ideas or seeing other people on, so it started with TV and hearing it on radio, but of course now it's in our pockets.
Yeah, now we have, we're talking about something that's exploding right before our eyes and ears, and that is the information, people living not in their own community, but in a community, an international community, meta community that's on. So, and you have all these influencers and people, and in children particularly, and this is not our theme, but the children particularly are affected by this because it used to be children had a hard time just situating themselves and dealing with kids on the playground. Now they're dealing with thousands of people on the internet. And how to situate themselves. That's a whole different problem. Now, the question we wanted to come to was, what about the church?
Yeah, the reason this came up is because the two services in church, we were talking about, when did that start?
Well,
two different services.
I'd say no more than 20 years ago, 20, 30 years ago, maybe at the most, and that mainly had to do with music. And music is one of the big carriers of culture. Music, where somebody's from and what they are like, and what culture they're from by what music they listen to and what music they play. But there was music. The old people just didn't want. When I was growing up, we had hymns, and then we had what we called choruses. They were short songs you could memorize, and they were sung mainly by young people. My mom knew a bunch of them. And she used to work with the youth. And then when we got into the charismatic renewal, it was primarily choruses. That is songs that we could sing from memory. And though I've been in the charismatic or Pentecostal that group for 60 years, I guess, almost 55 years.
Yeah.
And I have been in churches that had the screen up where you could read it.
Mm-hmm.
But primarily, and ones I always enjoyed was where you just sing from memory. Now we have books, like in our congregation, we have books, but we generally just sing from memory because you tend to flow, right?
Mm-hmm.
And in a primitive church, you don't have time you don't really want to always take the time for everybody to look up the hymn.
Mm-hmm.
You don't want to always take time. Sometimes you just want to flow.
Mm-hmm.
And someone has a hymn and he starts singing it, or it's a chorus, and sing it, But in the old days, it was the hymns. And when the new songs came on, radio songs, they call them, and they could be choruses or it could be just new songs.
Yeah.
Especially from the radio. You hear from Christian radio. And a little peppier. Then they have the band up there. And then the old folks just said, what is this? And so they decided, well, we'll have one. Since the older folk can get up earlier and get here, we have a traditional service for them, and then we'll have a hippie hoppy service for the young people. Yeah. But that's about maybe 30 years ago.
The problem, though, I see is when you brought up the idea of entertainment and seeker-friendly churches, mega churches that have smoke and
lights,
rock and roll lights, and they don't even have two services. That's just both the services.
Yeah,
they have two services because they have too many people. But it tends to be an outshoot of this trying new things, the less conservative approach to church.
Yeah, and of course it's that idea of, well, we don't have to do what old church says. It's old and it's not lively, and the fact of the matter is not many people are attracted to it. They don't come to church, and so. But again, you have that, so we can do this, new stuff, attractive stuff, and people come, and so again, there's that flavor of urbanity. Lots of people, reaching.
I don't know if urbanity is. I know what you mean by that, but I think it might be more of, I use the word opulence, or, just having.
The means to do it.
Yeah, the means to do it. Yeah.
Yeah, well, that's for sure. Now, you don't find any little country church that's going to be able to have smoking lights.
And people setting aside time to
run the sound system.
Yeah.
And though their music might be upbeat and everything, all of those things. But, and they are, as the Babylon Bee pointed out, they are distractions. The lights, they can be distractions. You wonder, are you listening to the spirit within? Or are you wondering, what's going on here? I don't know. I don't want to be critical, because I just dismiss the whole thing out of hand, but it's not worth getting into the weeds about it.
But it's also something you get with what I call entrepreneurial ecclesiology, where we just have people springing up churches. They want to do church a certain way, they make a church. It's like, that's how they want to do it.
And you can't dismiss the fact that they want to reach people, and they want to reach people. And if you don't reach people, the question is, it really is, how? And are you doing God's will? Are you at peace with God about doing it this way? And everybody has to make their decision. The generation, I think it is a generational gap. I think it began with young people, but any of that stuff, any innovations in the church begin with, a lot of, if they're real big innovations like that, like the lights and so on, they begin with young people, but they of course, as the young people get older, they bring them on in. And I don't, what's happening now generational in the church today, I don't know. Sometimes I think the idea is, obviously music is a big deal generationally. Dress for church. And I would say in general, informality in church has been brought in as a generational thing, so that we're not. And I think I would hope that the idea of sitting in rows and listening to one man up there preach, that would go by the by, but apparently it hasn't. As long as they get their band and the lights and the smoke, they're willing to go along with it, which is strange to me.
Well, that I've talked to more so the Orthodox people that have very strong theological reasons that goes behind that.
Behind what?
Facing the front and pointing towards
But
God.
are those the same people that have lights and smoke?
No.
Yeah,
well, they have
that's
incense.
What I'm saying. Okay. Well, I got that.
Incense is a pretty
that's
old.
Yeah. Oh yeah, and I like it, but some people rebel against. I like it.
Yeah.
Oh yeah. Well, the whole idea of the altar and all that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I'm sorry. But what we were talking about is why if it's I found it strange that if it's young people and youth and breaking the old ways, that they break with quiet, reverent music and quiet, reverent environment, and they have all of this loud and bright and smoky and all that, and they can still have
regimented.
Seats. Regimented seats. It's odd. Not everybody would see it, and especially if you're trying to reach out to 5,000 people at a time. So you got, as some dear brother of mine pointed out. Yeah, I understand, man. But when you guys got 15, that's one thing. When we got 15,000, you can't really sit in a circle,
Yeah. Oh, they have half circle. It's like stadium seating.
Yeah. The half circle is, I like that. Who has that? Where did I see that? Where did I see? Must have been at the church we saw. Jim Chalk took us to see last year the bluegrass thing, and it was in a church had semicircle. That was good. See other people.
Yeah.
See other people, not the backs of their heads.
Yeah. Of course, I've come from a church where we met in the round. I really appreciated that. Yeah. No longer there.
But we're talking about what the gap between younger people. Gap. See the gap, and so it of course it seems to be on the face of it not a good thing to have a gap between younger and older people. Now.
So should the other
I can't say. No, I say I have no.
Yeah.
I'm not prescribing anything. I'm saying I think anybody can say, well, just take a family. All right. Should there be a gap between the mother and father and the children? No. And even if they grow older, should there be a gap between the kids and their mother and dad? Well, what kind of gap? Not a gap, but a differences. Sure, there are going to be differences. There's differences between you guys and your mother and me, but there's no gap. I don't think there's a gap.
Well, I guess define gap. Like, what do you mean by gap?
That's good. I knew you were going to say that. I would say that it divides you such that you know that you're not a part of them and they're not a part of you, and that you reject some ways to do things.
A contentious.
Yeah, because you reject.
Force. Yeah,
I don't want to do it that way. I mean, I had rejected the way my parents, their church did church. I rejected it. I thought
adversarial force between.
Yeah. And I mean, that's old people. The reason they had the two services is because the old people, we can't put up with this. It wasn't the young people; it was the old people. So, I mean, the least amount of that is the best, if you ask me. Of course, the smaller the church, the easier it is to do that.
Yeah. Well, what we do at our church now is we combine the two every month.
So you have two services,
and then combine them and have one service every so often. Yeah.
And then you alternate as to whether you're going to wear flip flops or not.
Oh, well, it's funny because we often have it out at Camp Albemarle where it's kind of hard to.
Well, that's kind of concession to the younger generation.
Yeah.
Well, one thing about generation gaps, and we need to wind up here, but one thing about generation gaps, and the same thing I think for denominations is you have to start with respect for the one other Christian with whom you're dealing. You know,
Mm.
you always think about, can I be united with this person?
Mm.
You know, and not be thinking about all those guys over there and all the, you know, just, am I united with this person?
Yeah.
And use that. And obviously you're going to, when you're with a brother in the faith, you're going to make very little of denominational differences, you know.
Well, particular superficial ones, right?
Well, it's hard to say what is superficial, what isn't. Well, you mean like,
well,
what superficial?
Not theological. If there's
not theological,
yeah.
We were saying,
maybe it's not superficial, but cultural. The cultural differences are not so.
So anything outside the Apostles' Creed, like that, something like that, just something basic, you know. And so we start there, and we learn to love each other and respect each other that way, and then we try to grow out from that, so that our heart grows larger, so that, you know, when we come into a congregation of the same kind of people, if they're doing things that we don't like, it's not to our taste, we're still able to love them and respect them.
Well,
I sure hope so.
I think the thing that wakes us up out of this sort of kabuki theater of just doing, you know, trying to get along, and focus us more on loving each other in the moment, bringing us in the moment, is survival. But since we don't have that push of survival of you know, having enough to eat, I wonder, one thing that I've started to shift to is survival of my faith, survival of my spirituality, survival of my soul.
Yeah,
I think Christians are going to, I feel myself feeling that urgency, you know, that if I don't love this person, I'm not going to survive. You know, I'm not going to, but not physically. It won't be a physical death, but the death of my soul.
Yeah, and I thought you were going to say, there will be a lot more unity when we're under heavy persecution, if we ever are.
That is true.
We might be under a lot more attack than we think. You know, if we think about what is taking our mind off our relationship with the Lord Jesus Christ and the Heavenly Father, you know, and all of the world. It's the world really that's coming against us. The world, and if the world, it may not come against us in the form of communists knocking on our door and sending us to jail if we don't give up our Bible or something. You know? It may be just the whole, as you said, riches that cause people to, you know, I don't need to do this anymore. I can do whatever I want to do, you know, and a lot of things that attract us. The lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, the pride of life. You know? I always remember that song. If the world from you withhold all its silver and its gold, and you have to get along with meager fare. I don't get it's just an old. It's an old, you know. But that urbanity that I was talking about, which causes a lot of this, is in a large part the riches of this life of America. The riches. I'm not going to condemn it. We feed the world in some sense, you know. We protect a lot of the world, but that richness is an attack on, as you said, it's an attack on our
soul,
on our hearts. And so, well, I think that's
good.
Back to the basics. Go back to the basics.
Well, and you know, back to the basics, but also I think sometimes I get too caught up in the macro vision of everything, you know, like worrying about systems or whatever, when really it just comes down to your daily relationships.
There we go. Good.
Your daily interactions. You know? Those things really don't matter when we talk, you know, when I'm talking to you, or when I'm talking to somebody who could be a potential enemy, you know, like a neighbor if I don't get along with. These things are the things that matter.
Amen. That's good. Something to remember and work on.
Yeah. Amen. Hey, we would love it if you guys would leave a
little note,
a little comment, or even just give us a thumbs up. Let us know you're watching. See, about 5 people are watching right now. Andrea Flores says, "This is my personal preference, but I prefer the solemn hymns and parish sing-along to smoke and drums."
Yeah. Sure.
Well, I mean, that points out that there is there is a segment
Andrea.
of the Andrea, of the younger generations that, and I think more and more that want to get back to some of the basics, what you call primitive church.
Primitive church.
Getting back to the prime. I
had a buddy. He's probably listening now. The buddy says he was really interested in these scholars that went back or going back to really unearth what the original church was like, back in the first century. And I said, well, have they read the book of Acts in First Corinthians? That may be simplistic, but I still think I would like us to go back.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Andrea, for tuning in and leaving a comment, and it gave us a heart. So I appreciate that very much. And we will be back next week,
Lord willing,
or the creek don't rise.